I am 74 years old, retired in the Philippines. Retired in the Philippines? As you can see, I don't look like a Filipino. However, my wife was raised in the Philippines. When we married in Switzerland, she was citizen of the Philippines and of the United States. This would explain in principle why the two of us ended up in the Philippines. Actually, it's a bit more complicated. So in this video I will explain how this came about. In the last roughly 35 years, I was working in Switzerland as a consultant for engineering projects and as a teacher in math and physics. In the year 2022, I was still working as a teacher while my wife took care of the household. We have a daughter who is married and works as a registered nurse in a hospital nearby the place in Switzerland where we used to live. At that time, I noticed that my wife did not do the laundry anymore. She just piled up dirty laundry on the stairs along the walls. At first, she claimed that the washing machine wasn't working anymore. When I looked into this, she changed her story. The washing machine worked properly, but she just couldn't manage to pick up the dirty laundry, put it into the washing machine, and initiate the process. When I went to work, my wife got up early in the morning to prepare breakfast for me, and when I returned from work in the evening, she had prepared supper for me. What escaped my attention was that, just as she had stopped doing laundry, she apparently also stopped preparing food for herself, resulting in a rapid loss of weight. Once I noticed her standing on a bathroom scale. I heard her murmuring something about weight loss. I looked at her more closely, realizing how skinny she was all of a sudden. I started to observe her more closely, questioning her about her eating habits. At that time, she was down to roughly 85 pounds. I consulted with the family doctor, and it was decided that we would hire a special catering service which prepares and delivers food to households similar to the food served in airplanes. This service, called Spitex in Switzerland, is subsidized. This went on for a while, but the weight loss continued at a reduced rate. I started forcing her to eat enough calories to maintain her weight. Facing this steady weight loss, I became desperate and I got scared of myself. Eventually, it got to a point where I asked the family doctor to have her admitted to a psychiatric hospital for treatment of eating disorder. I told him that I felt aggressions against her and that I was afraid I might hurt her sometime in the future. The family doctor agreed to admit her to a psychiatric hospital. I dropped her off at the psychiatric hospital located roughly 50 miles from where we lived. I visited her on weekends and sometimes on my way home from work. At the hospital, they managed to stop the weight loss. She even put on a few pounds. Around Christmas, a relative of my wife in the Philippines suggested that I invite her niece Sheila to take care of her. I was afraid to take my wife back from the hospital, but I was eager to try this possibility of a relative of my wife taking care of her. So I explained at the hospital that what had been suggested appeared very promising to me, and I invited Sheila for a stay in Switzerland for 2 months, which corresponds to the maximum length of stay permitted by the type of visa we applied for. After Sheila arrived, we brought my wife back home, and her niece Sheila cared for her. Everything worked perfectly fine, except that my wife started to complain about unbearable pain. We had to bring her to the hospital several times. At one time she had pneumonia, but at other times there was no clear-cut evidence of a particular ailment. When Sheila's stay in Switzerland expired after 2 months, I hired caregivers from an agency. This agency recruited caregivers from Eastern Europe. Like Sheila, those caregivers could stay in Switzerland for at most 2 months. However, working full-time meant 40 hours per week. The contracts prepared by the agency were for full-time, in other words, 40 hours per week. 24/7 would amount to 186 hours per week, which means roughly 4 times the 40 hours per week corresponding to full-time employment. I could get some caregivers to sign up for overtime, offering extra pay. Most caregivers also would adjust their schedule more or less to the sleeping habits of my wife. If my wife woke up at night, I had to get up and take care of her. Since I was still working full-time, I was more and more exhausted. Several times I had to take my wife to the hospital, but there was never a clear-cut diagnosis for an illness which could explain her suffering. Finally, my wife was diagnosed by a neurologist as suffering from Parkinson's disease. From then on, she took medicine against Parkinson's disease. Before my wife was discharged from the hospital, I was invited for a talk with the attending physician. When we met for the talk, there was also a head physician of the Department of General Medicine present. The attending physician said that since the diagnosis now was that my wife was suffering from Parkinson's disease, she would have to be cared for by professionals in a nursing home. The head physician didn't say much, but to me the two were very intimidating. I suggested continuing with the care provided by the caregiver at home, but this idea was summarily dismissed by the two physicians. I could secure a place in a nursing home in the village where we lived at that time. It was an arrangement where the occupant of the place could stay for 3 weeks on a trial basis. This cost around $5,000. I thought this was ideal, but my wife didn't like it at all. She made it clear to me that she just went along in order to stop me from nagging. Together with the caregiver, I brought my wife to the nursing home. I had paid the caregiver for the entire period of stay, and I thought I would let her stay until her contract expired. The caregivers were transported by their agency anyway. The driver had with him all the legal documents necessary for the many border crossings in Europe. That the caregiver sticked around proved to be very fortunate a short time later. When I left my wife in the nursing home, she stayed in the bed with a fence on the side to prevent her from dropping to the floor. It remained the same when I returned in the following days. It was always the same situation. My wife shouted help when I entered the room. I always saw a glass full of water for her to drink. This should have made me suspicious right from the start. On her third day in the nursing home, I arrived at dinner time. One person had to serve dinner for all the occupants of the floor. When I arrived, my wife complained that she wanted to go home where a caregiver would serve her. The woman in charge of serving the meal was visibly irritated by her complaints. I observed that my wife tried to eat one of the French fries on her plate, without success. At the hospital, special mashed food was served to her because she had trouble swallowing, a typical problem for patients with Parkinson's disease. I pointed out the problem to the distressed lady serving the food. She answered that my wife can eat the food that she saw her eating the day before. When I brought my wife to the nursing home, I thought that I was following medical advice by two physicians, but slowly I came to the conclusion that I was dealing with a bunch of morons. After this, I looked for a bathroom scale, but I couldn't find one anywhere. My request seemed to induce a hostile atmosphere. I went home to get our bathroom scale. When I asked my wife to stay on the scale, I measured 76 pounds, down from 82 pounds when she left for the nursing home. Always measured with the same bathroom scale. At first I was shocked, but then it seemed not very plausible to me that she would lose 2 pounds per day. On the other hand, it was quite obvious that her body weight approached a critical limit very fast. However, it seemed rude to me to leave the place without prior notice. So I decided to let her stay until the next morning, following proper checkout procedures. I also had to teach the following morning, such that I couldn't pick her up before noon. When I arrived at the nursing home, there were no questions asked as to why my wife would terminate her stay prematurely. I guess it was quite clear that my wife didn't want to stay there in the first place. They just pointed out to me that I wouldn't be refunded for the remaining 16 days. They argued that this was according to the fine print in the contract I signed. So I ended up paying around $1,000 for each day my wife spent in the nursing home. I thought we were treated unfairly by the nursing home. However, discussing this issue, I became more familiar with the financial aspects of staying in a nursing home in Switzerland. When you get a brochure from a nursing home in Switzerland, then what is shown on this brochure concerning the costs, this is for the basic level of care. So if at a later time you need assistance, for example, for getting dressed in the morning or something like that, the level of care would not be the basic level of care anymore. The level of care would increase and there would be additional costs. For this additional care, the nursing home would charge you with overhead maybe $100 per hour, which per month would amount to $3,000. In my case, my wife with Parkinson's disease, I would have to expect to have to pay anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 per month. When at a later time I was talking to several relatives of my wife who were working as nurses in the Philippines, but also in other countries such as Canada, New Zealand, the Emirates, Spain, etc., they told me that patients with not very severe forms of Parkinson's disease could be cared for properly in a nursing home if monitored continuously by the family doctor. For severe cases of Parkinson's disease, they weren't quite sure whether it would be a good idea to have them cared for in a nursing home. The residents of a nursing home are given medication for ailments prevalent in this population, such as insomnia, depression, dementia, etc. The nursing home on its own would only be allowed to administer over-the-counter medicine. Medication other than that would have to be administered under the supervision of a physician. However, these physicians just prescribe medication for prevalent ailments such that their patients attain the highest possible quality of life under these circumstances. To me, it seemed that these nurses knew what they were talking about, but their assessment differed significantly from what I was told by 2 doctors in Switzerland. After this very short episode with a nursing home, I continued with the services of the caregivers from the agency. These caregivers in general cared very well for my wife. Then we got one which broke this pattern in extreme ways. My wife told me that when I was out of the house, she couldn't get any help from this caregiver as she was in her room chatting on social media platforms. When we went shopping, she wanted us to buy some strange items for the household. We later realized that she stashed those items somewhere and took them with her when she left. When she left, the US passport of my wife and our wedding rings also were missing. These wedding rings were engraved and therefore irreplaceable. When she was gone, we contacted the police, but having no proof, there was very little that could be done. I would have been prepared to continue with the services provided by the caregivers referred to us from the agency. However, I got tired of this periodic change of caregivers in time intervals of 2 months, and I was exhausted from getting up at night to take care of my wife. Eventually, I began to think seriously about bringing my wife to the Philippines and looking there for affordable professional help. What made me hesitate was health insurance. Being above 70, no insurance company would offer us an insurance policy. The only alternative left was that we would have to pay in cash for any medical services required. Since my wife was fit for travel, I thought that I might bring her to the Philippines and find out whether this would be feasible. I got Sheila to fly to Switzerland and fly with the 2 of us back to the Philippines. In the Philippines, we have a place in the province Rizal where we can stay. It's a compound enclosed with walls with a couple of buildings on it. We could have hired a caregiver with a salary of typically around $500 per month and free food and accommodation. However, I was afraid of bad experiences such as the ones we had before. So we hired 2 registered nurses who, taking turns, provided 24/7 care. Their combined salaries were more than double the average salary of a caregiver, but I didn't want any more unpleasant surprises. I left my wife with 2 nurses in the Philippines and flew back to Switzerland to continue to work. Switzerland remained her official place of residence for 3 months, such that she could keep her health insurance. After that time, I had to report her as immigrated, and her health insurance expired automatically. After additional 3 months, I flew to the Philippines to find out how they were doing. At that point, my wife was still fit for travel. I would have taken her back with me if there had been any serious doubts. I was impressed when I saw how well the nurses were organized. They had prepared a checklist of daily chores. And they kept a handwritten medical record showing medication administered, intake of food and beverages, exercises done, etc.
Ibaba mo yan.
Ano na siya? Direct na siya mag-flow.
Yun ang gamitin mo
So I flew back to Switzerland, leaving my wife behind in the Philippines. Shortly after I had left for Switzerland, my wife got shingles. She had to be driven to the hospital with an ambulance, where she stayed a few days in intensive care. She was given infusions with medicine in regular time intervals. We live in Sampaloc province of Rizal, but we always go to the Manila East Medical Center, 40 miles distant. In heavy traffic, this would take more than 2 hours one way, but the ambulance drivers are very skilled navigating in heavy traffic, such that they usually reach their destination in a bit more than half of the time usually required.
On 3 pa. 2. 3 malakas yan. Only 3. Number 3. Wait.
I cannot see it then. First the 3.
Ay, saan?
Oh, there.
Ayan.
We can hire an ambulance from the barangay. Barangay means municipality. For both ways, we pay only around $50 US. When the ambulance arrives at the hospital, everything is prepared for the incoming patient.
Ngayon kung ang problema lang ay kulang yung kanyang oral intake, hindi siya nasasabihin, pakabayagan siya ng utang. So kaya...
Sinabi ko po kay Dr. Cabrera yung nasasabi. Tanong ko po sa inyo.
Hindi, yung nasasabihin kasi, ang problema naman, hindi naman dito mag-a-ask.
After making sure that my wife was properly cared for in the Philippines, I proceeded to the third phase of the operation. I was preparing to join my wife in the Philippines. At first I wanted to sell our house, but I didn't know what to do with the money except putting into a bank account. So I let a married couple with 2 small boys rent the house after doing some minor renovations. Over a time period of several months, I sorted things out and shipped all useful items of the household to the Philippines. Like my wife, I'm no longer covered by health insurance. With each quarterly payment for health insurance in Switzerland, I could pay for a major surgery in the Philippines. From what I experienced, those major surgeries would be performed in the Philippines with standards comparable to those in Switzerland. So I'm not worried, not for me, and not for my wife. If I would have stayed in Switzerland, sooner or later I probably would have been forced to put my wife into a nursing home. I myself would have to look for a small apartment, and after 2 years a significant portion of our savings for retirement would be gone. Here in the Philippines I'm surrounded by friendly people. I get to know their families. I can rest assured that my wife gets the best possible care. This is only possible because I'm able to provide what here in the Philippines is considered fair pay for excellent service. Some people may be inspired to follow my example. I don't know any expats here, but I hear Filipinos talking about expats and the mess some of them leave behind. This country has its own problems. It is under no obligation whatsoever to fix problems of affluent Western societies. So if you don't know how to appreciate the kindness and hospitality of its people, please stay where you are. Don't come.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Mommy. Mommy.
Tulog.
Me.
Tulog na tulog.
Me, open your eyes, oh. Me.